The sun broke over the prairie like spilled honey, painting the red dust gold and stretching shadows long across the scrubland. A hawk circled high above, its cry cutting through the morning stillness as the wind gathered tumbleweeds and sent them rolling past the weathered fence posts. This was cattle country, where the horizon seemed to go on forever, and a man could ride for days without seeing another soul. Ruth Caldwell stood on the porch of her father's ranch house, one hand shading her eyes as she watched the distant hills shimmer in the heat. At 22, she had the lean strength of someone who'd grown up working the land, her hands calloused from mending fences and tending livestock. Her brown hair, usually pinned neat, had come loose in the morning breeze, and she absently tucked a strand behind her ear. There was a weariness in her gray eyes that went deeper than physical exhaustion. It was the look of someone who'd watched too many seasons pass with too little to show for them. The ranch, if it could still be called that, consisted of 40 acres of stubborn earth that fought every attempt at cultivation. Her father, Josiah, had claimed it 15 years ago with dreams of prosperity, but the land had other ideas. Now it was just the two of them, scratching out a living with a dozen head of cattle and whatever vegetables survived the scorching summers. "Ruth," her father's voice carried from the barn, "that heifer's gotten into the feed again." She sighed and made her way across the dusty yard, her boots leaving prints that the wind immediately began to erase. As she passed the water trough, she caught her reflection's sun-browned skin, angular features softened by youth but hardened by circumstance. Not beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was something arresting about her, a quiet dignity that caught the eye. It was at church where she first truly noticed Samuel Morrison, though he'd been attending services in Cedar Ridge for near 3 months. The small wooden chapel sat at the center of town, its whitewashed walls and simple cross the focal point of the community's spiritual life. Samuel always sat 3 pews from the front, his broad shoulders straight, his attention fixed on Reverend Thomas's sermons with an intensity that spoke of genuine faith. He was different from the other cowboys who drifted through quieter, more thoughtful, where they spent their wages on whiskey and cards. Samuel saved his money and spoke of buying land, starting a proper spread. His sandy hair was always neatly trimmed, his clothes clean despite the dust that coated everything in this part of Texas. When he sang hymns, his baritone voice carried clear and true. Ruth found herself stealing glances at him during services, admiring the way his hands, strong and work-worn like her own, held the hymnal with surprising gentleness. He had the kind of face that inspired trust, honest blue eyes, a straight nose that had been broken at least once, and a jaw that suggested stubbornness tempered by kindness. Their first real conversation happened during the harvest social, when the whole town gathered to bring in the Hendersons' wheat. Ruth was serving lemonade from a table set up in the shade of a cottonwood tree when Samuel approached, hat in hand. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice carrying a hint of Tennessee drawl. "Might I trouble you for a glass?" "No trouble at all. Mr. Morrison," she poured carefully, aware of the other young women watching with interest. Samuel Morrison was considered quite the catch-steady employment at the Bar J Ranch. No drinking or gambling habits, and handsome in that understated way that grew on you. "Fine weather for the harvest," he observed, taking the glass with a nod of thanks. "My father says it's the best in 5 years." Ruth found herself smiling. "Though he says that every year when there's work to be done and hands to recruit." Samuel's laugh was warm and genuine. "Sounds like a wise man. Hard work goes down easier with a little optimism mixed in." They talked for a few more minutes, about the weather, the challenges of ranching, the new schoolhouse being built on the eastern edge of town. Nothing profound, but Ruth felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits who understood that life out here was equal parts hardship and hope. As autumn progressed, their encounters became more frequent and less accidental. Samuel would happen to be in town when Ruth came for supplies. He began attending the Wednesday night prayer meetings that Ruth never missed. When the church needed repairs to its roof, both were among the volunteers who showed up to help. "You handle a hammer better than most men," Samuel told her one afternoon as they worked side by side, replacing damaged shingles. Ruth smiled, wiping sweat from her brow. "My father believed in teaching me everything. Said a woman alone in this country needed to know how to take care of herself." "He's not wrong," Samuel agreed, his expression growing serious. "Though I hope you won't always have to be alone." The words hung between them, weighted with possibility. Ruth felt her cheeks warm and turned back to her work, but she was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way the afternoon sun caught the gold in his hair. By the time the first frost touched the prairie grass, Samuel was calling on her proper. He'd ride out to the Caldwell Ranch on Sunday afternoons, sitting with Ruth on the porch while her father cleaned his rifle just inside the door, close enough to chaperone, far enough to allow conversation. They talked about everything and nothing. Samuel shared his plans to save enough to buy the old Henderson place when they moved back east. Ruth spoke of her mother, dead these 10 years from fever, and how she sometimes felt her presence in the wind that swept across the plains. They discovered a shared love of books, precious and rare in these parts, and Samuel began bringing her volumes he borrowed from the Bar J's small library. "I want to build something lasting," he told her one evening as the sun painted the sky crimson and gold. "A place where a family can put down roots, where children can grow up knowing they belong to the land as much as it belongs to them." Ruth understood. It was what her father had wanted, what everyone who came to this unforgiving country wanted. But in Samuel's voice, she heard something more, not just ambition, but conviction, and a quiet invitation for her to share in that dream. When he finally asked Josiah Caldwell for permission to marry his daughter, it was with the same straightforward honesty that characterized everything about Samuel Morrison. The two men sat in the small parlor, coffee cooling between them, while Ruth pretended to busy herself with mending in the kitchen, straining to hear every word. "I know I don't have much to offer yet," Samuel said, "but I've saved near $200, and Mr. Jameson at the Bar J has promised me steady work through the winter. I figure by spring, I'll have enough for a down payment on land." Josiah was quiet for a long moment. Ruth knew her father had hoped for better prospects for his only child, perhaps a merchant's son or even one of the banker's nephews who'd been showing interest. But he also knew Samuel Morrison to be a good man, steady and God-fearing. "You'll treat her right?" It wasn't really a question. "With my life, sir." And so it was settled. The wedding was planned for late October, before the winter storms made travel difficult. It would be a simple affair. Ruth had no illusions about that. There was no money for a fancy dress or elaborate reception. But Reverend Thomas agreed to perform the ceremony, and that was what mattered. The morning of the wedding dawned clear, but with an edge to the air that spoke of change coming. Ruth stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, wearing her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved these 20 years, smelling faintly of lavender and memories. The ivory fabric, yellowed with age, had been taken in to fit her slimmer frame, and Martha Henderson had donated a length of blue ribbon for her hair. The church was full when Josiah walked her down the aisle, not because the Caldwells were particularly important, but because weddings were rare causes for celebration in Cedar Ridge. Samuel waited at the altar, looking uncomfortable in his borrowed suit but smiling with such genuine joy that Ruth felt her heart swell. Reverend Thomas, gray-bearded and kind-eyed, raised his hands over them as they knelt before the simple wooden cross. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Samuel and Ruth, two souls who have found in each other a helpmate for the journey ahead." The words of the ceremony washed over Ruth like a warm rain. She was aware of Samuel's hand in hers, steady and sure, of the way the afternoon light slanted through the windows, of the distant rumble of thunder that made several people glance nervously at the sky. "Let no man put asunder what God has joined together," Reverend Thomas intoned, his voice carrying the weight of sacred authority. He placed his weathered hands on their bowed heads. The preacher blessed their union. "May the Lord guide your steps and guard your hearts against all temptation and sin. May your love be as constant as the sunrise and as enduring as these ancient hills. As they rose and Samuel kissed her, briefly, chastely, but with promise, the first fat raindrops began to fall. By the time they made their dash from the church to the waiting wagon, the sky had opened up, sending guests scurrying for cover and turning the street to mud. But Ruth didn't mind. Pressed against Samuel's side as he drove them toward the small cabin he'd prepared on the edge of the Bar J property, she felt a contentment she'd never known before. The rain drummed on the wagon's canvas cover, and lightning flickered across the darkening sky. But she was heading toward her new life with hope in her heart. Behind them, the townspeople of Cedar Ridge watched them go, some with genuine good wishes, others with the peculiar mix of envy and judgment that small towns breed. There were whispers, of course, about the Caldwell girl marrying beneath even her modest station, about Samuel Morrison's ambitious plans that would surely come to nothing, about how long it would be before poverty and hardship drove them apart. But as Ruth leaned her head against her new husband's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him through the damp cloth of his jacket, she allowed herself to believe that love and faith might be enough to build a life on, even in this unforgiving land. The storm that had blessed their wedding day would pass, as all storms did, leaving the earth renewed and ready for whatever seeds they chose to plant. That night, in the simple cabin that was now their home, Ruth knelt beside the narrow bed and offered a prayer of gratitude. For Samuel, for the new life stretching before them, for the courage to face whatever trials might come. Outside, the wind howled across the prairie, but within these walls, she had found sanctuary. The summer of 1876 arrived like an unwelcome guest, bringing with it a heat that seemed to rise from the very bones of the earth. The grass turned brittle and brown, crackling underfoot like old paper, and the few streams that hadn't already dried up were reduced to muddy trickles. Even the hardy mesquite trees seemed to droop under the relentless sun, their leaves curled tight to preserve what little moisture they could. Ruth stood in the doorway of their cabin, watching the heat shimmer off the packed dirt yard. It had been 3 days since Samuel left with the other Bar J hands to drive a small herd north to the railhead at Abilene. 3 days of silence broken only by the whisper of hot wind through the rafters and the distant cry of buzzards circling something dead out on the prairie. She pressed a hand to the small of her back, easing the ache that had settled there from hours spent hauling water from the well. The vegetables she'd planted with such hope in the spring were struggling despite her best efforts. The corn stood stunted and yellow. The beans had withered on the vine, and only the stubborn squash plants showed any promise of harvest. "Mrs. Morrison?" The voice startled her. She turned to find Tom Garrett, one of the Bar J cowboys, sitting his horse at the edge of the yard. Dust coated him from hat to boots, and his mount's head hung low with exhaustion. "Tom," she acknowledged, stepping out onto the porch. "You're back early. Is everything well?" He shifted in the saddle, not quite meeting her eyes. "Yes, ma'am. That is, the drive's going fine. Mr. Morrison sent me back with a message. Said to tell you they've run into some delays. Had to go around some trouble up near the Red River. Might be another week, maybe 2, before they're home." Ruth kept her expression neutral, though her heart sank. 2 more weeks alone. "What kind of trouble?" "Rustlers, ma'am. A gang of them operating along the cattle trails. Nothing for you to worry about. We went plenty wide around them." He touched his hat brim. "I best be getting back. You need anything before I go?" "No, thank you. Tom, I'll manage." After he left, trailing a cloud of red dust, Ruth allowed herself a moment of weakness. She sank onto the porch step, fighting the urge to cry. It wasn't just the loneliness, though that was part of it. It was the weight of trying to hold everything together. The failing garden, the repairs the cabin needed, the endless battle against the heat and dust and isolation. In town, she knew. People were talking. She'd heard the whispers last Sunday at church, seen the knowing looks exchanged between the merchant wives. Poor little Ruth Morrison. They seemed to say, married that cowboy and now look at her, wilting away like everything else in this godforsaken heat. The worst part was Margaret Campbell, whose husband owned the general store. She'd cornered Ruth after services, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "My dear, you're looking rather peaked. This life doesn't suit everyone. You know, perhaps when Samuel returns, you might consider moving into town. I hear the boarding house has a nice room available." Ruth had managed a polite response, but the implication stung, that she wasn't strong enough, wasn't suited for the life she'd chosen, that she'd married beneath herself and was now paying the price. She pushed herself to her feet, squaring her shoulders. There was work to be done, and self-pity wouldn't get it finished. The chicken coop needed cleaning. The fence around the garden required mending where a coyote had tried to dig under, and she needed to check the water barrels. As she worked through the afternoon, sweat soaking through her dress despite the shade she sought, her mind wandered to the stories that had begun circulating through the territory. Tales of a gang led by a man named Jake Coulter, though some called him Cole, who robbed from the wealthy cattle barons and distributed the spoils among poor Mexican farmers and struggling homesteaders. Some painted him as a Robin Hood figure, others as a ruthless killer who'd shoot a man for looking at him wrong. Ruth had paid little attention to such stories until recently, when her father had visited and mentioned something that made her blood run cold. "Remember that drifter I helped years back?" Josiah had said, his voice low. "The one who'd been shot up pretty bad? Word is he's riding with this Coulter gang now. Goes by the name Cole Hardin." The memory of that time came flooding back. She'd been barely 14, but she remembered the stranger her father had hidden in their barn for nearly a month while he recovered from bullet wounds. Her father had never explained why he'd taken such a risk, only saying that the man had saved his life once and debts had to be paid. Ruth had snuck glimpses of him, dark-haired, intense, with eyes that seemed to hold secrets she was too young to understand. Now, 8 years later, that stranger had apparently become one of the most wanted men in Texas. A dust devil swirled across the yard, and Ruth paused in her work to watch it dance. The isolation was getting to her. She knew. She found herself talking to the chickens as she scattered their feed, carrying on both sides of conversations with Samuel in her mind. The nights were the worst, when every crack of settling wood sounded like footsteps. Every coyote howl seemed closer than the last. She'd taken to sleeping with Samuel's rifle beside the bed, though she wondered if she'd have the courage to use it if necessary. Her father had taught her to shoot, but putting holes in tin cans was different from pointing a gun at a living person. 5 days after Tom's visit, Ruth was drawing water from the well when she heard horses approaching. Her heart leaped. Perhaps Samuel had returned early, but caution made her grab the rifle before stepping out to look. 3 riders were coming down the trail, moving slow and easy. As they drew closer, she could see they were strangers, rough-looking men with several days' worth of beard and clothes that had seen better days. They reined up just outside her fence line. "Afternoon, ma'am," the lead rider called out. He was a thin man with pale eyes that didn't match his friendly tone. "Wondering if we might trouble you for some water. Been riding hard and our canteens are near empty." Ruth kept the rifle lowered but visible. "There's a stream about 2 miles east. Still has water in it." The man's smile widened, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Now that's not very neighborly. The good book says to give drink to the thirsty. The good book also says to be wise as serpents," Ruth replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I don't know you, sir, and my husband wouldn't take kindly to me entertaining strangers." "Husband around?" This from one of the other riders, a younger man with a scar across his cheek. "Close enough to hear a gunshot." Ruth lied. The 3 men exchanged glances. The leader shrugged. "No offense meant, ma'am. We'll find that stream." He touched his hat brim mockingly. "You have a blessed day now." They rode off, but Ruth noticed they took their time, studying the cabin and outbuildings as they went. She stayed on the porch until they were out of sight, then hurried inside and barred the door. Her hands shook as she set the rifle down. That night, she barely slept. Every sound brought her bolt upright, peering through the gaps in the shutters. When dawn finally came, she was exhausted but relieved to find everything undisturbed. Still, The encounter had shaken her more than she cared to admit. The days blurred together in a haze of heat and worry. Ruth went through the motions of her daily tasks, but her mind was elsewhere. She found herself thinking about those three riders, about the outlaw Cole Hardin, who might or might not be the same man her father had sheltered, about Samuel somewhere out on the trail. She'd never felt the weight of her isolation quite so keenly. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. Town was a half-day's ride, and she hadn't seen another soul since those unwelcome visitors. Even the letters she'd been writing to Samuel seemed pointless. There was no one to deliver them until he returned. One afternoon, as storm clouds built on the northern horizon, promising rain that would probably never fall, Ruth sat on the porch with her mother's Bible in her lap. She tried to find comfort in the familiar passages, but the words seemed to mock her situation. "Be not afraid," Scripture said, but fear had become her constant companion. "The Lord is my shepherd," but she felt very much like a lost sheep. The sky darkened throughout the afternoon, the air growing heavy and still. By evening, lightning flickered in the distance, and the wind picked up, sending dust devils spinning across the yard. Ruth secured everything she could, closing shutters, bringing in tools, making sure the animals were sheltered. As she worked, her thoughts turned again to the past, to that wounded stranger in her father's barn. She remembered bringing him food one night when her father was away, how he'd looked at her with those dark eyes and said, "You're braver than you know, little one. Remember that when the storms come." Strange that she should think of those words now, as a real storm approached. Thunder rumbled closer, and the first fat raindrops began to fall, sending up puffs of dust where they hit the parched ground. Ruth stood in the doorway, watching the storm build, and found herself whispering a prayer, not just for rain to save what was left of her garden, but for Samuel's safe return, for strength to face whatever was coming, because something was coming. She could feel it in the electricity that charged the air, in the way the horses shifted restlessly in the corral, in the hollow ache beneath her breastbone that had nothing to do with loneliness and everything to do with premonition. The storm was coming, and with it, she feared, would come a reckoning with the past that neither she nor Samuel could have foreseen. The storm struck with a violence that seemed personal, as if the sky itself had been holding a grudge against the drought-stricken land. Lightning split the darkness in jagged white forks. Thunder followed so close it shook the cabin walls, and the rain came not in drops but in sheets that turned the yard into a muddy lake within minutes. Ruth struggled to secure the barn door that had blown open, the wind threatening to tear it from her grasp. Her dress was soaked through in seconds, clinging to her like a second skin as she fought against the gale. Hail began to fall, chunks of ice the size of quail eggs that stung where they struck exposed skin. She finally managed to loop the rope around the door handle and pull it tight, then stumbled toward the chicken coop. The birds were in a panic, squawking and flapping as water poured through gaps in the roof. There was nothing she could do for them now except hope the structure held. As she turned back toward the cabin, a flash of lightning illuminated the yard bright as noon, and in that split second, she saw him, a lone rider hunched against the storm, his horse struggling through the mud toward her gate. For one wild moment, she thought it was Samuel returned early, but another lightning flash showed her the truth. This man was taller, darker, and he sat his horse like someone accustomed to hard riding. Ruth ran for the cabin, her feet slipping in the mud. She burst through the door and grabbed the rifle, her hands shaking as much from cold as fear. Through the window, she could see the rider had dismounted and was leading his horse toward the barn. He moved with purpose but without threat, focused more on finding shelter than anything else. She waited, rifle ready, water pooling around her feet. Minutes passed. The storm raged on, but no one approached the cabin. Finally, curiosity overcame caution. She lit a lantern, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and ventured onto the porch. "Hello?" she called into the storm. "Who's there?" A figure emerged from the barn's shadow, hands raised to show they were empty. "Mrs. Morrison?" The voice was deep, roughened by weather and wear. "I mean no harm, just need shelter from the storm." Another lightning flash revealed his face, and Ruth's breath caught. Even through the rain and the years that had passed, she recognized him. The dark hair was longer now, streaked with premature gray. Lines carved by sun and hardship marked his face. But those eyes, intense, haunted, holding secrets, those were the same. "Cole," she breathed, though the wind snatched the word away. He heard it anyway. His hands lowered slowly. "Hello, Ruth. It's been a long time." She should have ordered him off her property, should have threatened to shoot if he didn't leave immediately. This was Cole Hardin, wanted outlaw, leader of a notorious gang. Instead, she heard herself saying, "You're hurt." He glanced down at his left arm, where dark stains spread through the wet fabric of his shirt. "It's nothing, just needs cleaning." Ruth warred with herself for a long moment. Everything sensible in her screamed to send him away. But there was her father's debt, the memory of a wounded man who'd shown kindness to a curious girl, and something else, a pull she didn't want to examine too closely. "Come inside," she said finally. "Quickly." He retrieved a saddlebag from his horse, then followed her into the cabin. In the lamplight, she could see him more clearly. The years had not been kind, where Samuel carried himself with quiet dignity. Cole moved like a wolf, wary, ready for violence, marked by it. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to a chair near the stove. "I'll get bandages." As she gathered what she needed, clean cloth, her father's whiskey for cleaning wounds, needle and thread. Her mind raced. What was he doing here? How had he found her? And more importantly, what would Samuel say if he knew she'd let this man into their home? "You married Morrison," Cole said as she returned. It wasn't a question. "Yes." She set the supplies on the table. "Take off your shirt." He complied without comment, revealing a lean torso marked by scars, some old and white, others more recent. The current wound was a deep gash along his upper arm, still seeping blood. "Knife?" she asked, beginning to clean the wound. "Something like that." He didn't flinch as the whiskey bit into raw flesh. "Your father spoke of you often, said you'd grown into a fine woman." He was right. "My father's been dead 2 years," Ruth said shortly, focusing on her work. "I know. I heard. I'm sorry." They lapsed into silence, broken only by the storm outside. Ruth tried not to notice the warmth radiating from his skin, the way his breathing changed when her fingers brushed a particularly sensitive spot. This was wrong. All wrong. She was a married woman tending to a stranger. No, worse than a stranger. A criminal. "Why are you here?" she asked as she began to stitch the wound closed. "Wasn't planning to be. Got separated from my men in the storm, turned around in the dark, saw your light and—" He paused. "Maybe I was looking for you without knowing it. Your father saved my life once. Figured his daughter might do the same." "I'm not my father." "No," he agreed, studying her face. "You're something else entirely." Ruth's hands stilled. There was weight in those words, meaning she didn't want to acknowledge. "There, you're patched up. You should go." "In this storm, my horse is half dead already." He pulled his wet shirt back on, wincing. "I'll stay in the barn if it makes you more comfortable. Be gone at first light." She knew she should insist he leave. Knew that every moment he remained put her reputation, her marriage, possibly her life at risk. But the storm showed no sign of abating, and sending even an outlaw out into such weather seemed cruel. "You can sleep by the stove," she said finally, "but you leave at dawn, and you never come back. Whatever debt existed between you and my father, consider it paid." He nodded, something flickering in his eyes that might have been disappointment. "Fair enough." Ruth busied herself making coffee, needing something to do with her hands. Cole sat quietly, his presence filling the small cabin in a way that made her acutely aware of every movement, every breath. She thought of Samuel, somewhere out on the trail, trusting her to keep their home safe. The guilt sat heavy in her stomach. "Tell me about your husband," Cole said suddenly. "Why?" Curious what kind of man won Ruth Caldwell's heart. She bristled at the familiarity. He's a good man, honest, hard-working, faithful, everything I'm not. In other words, Ruth turned to face him. Why did you become what you became? My father said you had promised once. Cole's laugh was bitter. Promise doesn't mean much when society's got its boot on your neck. I tried going straight after your father helped me. Got work on a ranch up north. Then the owner's son decided he didn't like the way I looked at his sister. Never mind that I'd never so much as spoken to her. They ran me off, but not before making sure every other ranch in 3 counties knew I was trouble. He stood, pacing to the window to watch the storm. After that, it was steal or starve. Found others in the same situation. Mexicans who'd lost their land to Anglo lawyers. Freed slaves with nowhere to go. Indians pushed off their territory. We made our own law because the official one sure wasn't interested in justice for our kind. So you rob and kill, Ruth said flatly. Rob? Yes, from those who can afford it. Kill? He turned back to her. Only when there's no other choice. Despite what the papers say, I'm not a murderer. Ruth. She wanted to challenge that, to point out that violence begat violence, that his choices had led him down a dark path, but something in his expression stopped her, a bone-deep weariness that spoke of a man who'd long ago accepted his fate. I should check your horse, he said abruptly. Make sure he's settled. He was gone before she could respond, disappearing into the storm with the ease of someone accustomed to moving through darkness. Ruth sank into a chair, her hands trembling now that she was alone. What had she done? What was she doing? When Cole returned, water streaming from his coat, she had composed herself. She pointed to a blanket near the stove. You can bed down there. I'll be in the other room. The door will be locked, and I'll have the rifle with me. Understood. He studied her for a moment. Ruth, thank you. I know what this costs you. She didn't answer, couldn't answer. Instead, she retreated to the bedroom, turning the key in the lock with a decisive click. But sleep wouldn't come. She lay in the bed she shared with Samuel, listening to the storm and the occasional creak of floorboards that told her Cole was awake too. Memories flooded back unbidden, that younger Cole, wounded and fevered, grabbing her hand as she brought him water. One day, he'd said, his voice rough with pain. When the storms come, I'll return. Good or bad, I'll return. She'd thought it was delirium talking. Now she wondered if it had been prophecy. The storm raged through the night, matching the turmoil in her heart. She was no longer the curious girl who'd been fascinated by a dangerous stranger, but the pull remained, dark and unsettling, like lightning illuminating things better left in shadow. When she finally dozed near dawn, her dreams were troubled. Samuel calling her name across a great distance. Cole standing in a doorway she couldn't quite close. Her father's voice, warning of debts that could never truly be paid. She woke to silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind the clean scent of rain-washed earth. Pale light filtered through the shutters. Ruth dressed quickly and quietly, then unlocked the door with the rifle in hand. The main room was empty. The blanket Cole had used was folded neatly by the cold stove. On the table sat a leather pouch and a note written in a bold, unpracticed hand. Ruth, for your kindness, tell no one I was here. Some sins are best claimed in silence. See, inside the pouch were 20 gold eagles, more money than she'd seen in years. Blood money, some would say. But as Ruth hefted the weight of it, she thought of the failing garden, the repairs needed, the supplies they couldn't afford. She thought of Samuel's dreams of building something lasting, and her own desire to help make those dreams real. She hid the pouch beneath a loose floorboard, where it seemed to pulse with its own dark energy. Then she opened the door to greet the new day, the storm-cleaned world sparkling with false innocence. In the barn, her horse nickered softly. The chickens emerged from their coop, bedraggled but alive. Everything appeared normal, but Ruth knew better. The storm had brought more than rain. It had brought a reckoning delayed but not denied, a reminder that some debts followed you no matter how far you ran or how deeply you buried them. and somewhere in her heart, in a place she refused to examine. She knew this wasn't over. Cole Hardin had claimed shelter for one night, but in doing so, he'd claimed something else, a piece of her carefully constructed life, a crack in the foundation she and Samuel were building. The preacher had blessed their union, but one stormy night, the outlaw had indeed come to claim something. Whether it was her sins or his own remained to be seen. The lamp flame flickered in the draft that seeped through the cabin walls, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn timber. Ruth's hands trembled as she unwound the makeshift bandage from Cole's arm, the blood having soaked through the cloth she'd hastily applied in the barn. The wound was worse than she'd initially thought, a deep gash that had torn through muscle, leaving edges that gaped like a mouth trying to speak. "Hold still," she murmured, reaching for the whiskey bottle. The amber liquid caught the lamplight as she poured it over the wound. Cole's jaw tightened, the cords in his neck standing out, but he made no sound beyond a sharp intake of breath. The storm continued its assault on the cabin. Rain driving against the windows with such force it sounded like handfuls of pebbles being thrown by an angry god. Thunder rolled across the plains in waves, each rumble seeming to shake the very foundation of Ruth's ordered world. "It needs stitching," she said, threading a needle with hands that had grown steady through necessity. Farm life taught you to mend what was torn fabric, flesh. It made little difference when survival was at stake. Cole watched her face as she worked, his dark eyes following every movement. "You've done this before. Cattle get caught in wire, horses kick, men get careless with tools." She didn't look up, concentrating on making small, neat stitches. "Life out here doesn't allow for squeamishness. Your father taught you well." The mention of Josiah made her needle pause. "He taught me to survive. There's a difference between that and living." "Is there?" Cole's voice was soft, contemplative. "Seems to me most folks are so busy surviving they forget to question if what they're protecting is worth the cost." Ruth tied off the thread and cut it with her teeth, an unladylike gesture that would have horrified the town women. "Samuel says life is about building something greater than yourself. Family, community, legacy." "Samuel." Cole tested the name like unfamiliar wine. "He makes you happy?" The question was too intimate, too presumptuous. Ruth busied herself cleaning up the medical supplies, her back to him. "He's a good husband. We have a good life. That's not what I asked." She whirled to face him, anger flashing in her eyes. "You have no right to ask such things. You're here because of an old debt in Christian charity, nothing more." Cole raised his hands in surrender, wincing as the movement pulled at his fresh stitches. "You're right. Forgive me. Prison makes a man forget his manners." "Prison?" She couldn't hide her curiosity. 2 years in Huntsville? Would have been longer, but the guards got careless during a transfer." His smile held no humor. "They say I killed 3 men during the escape. Truth is, I killed one, the one who was fixing to shoot a boy no older than 16 for moving too slow." Ruth poured 2 cups of coffee, needing the ritual of normalcy in this decidedly abnormal situation. The hot tin mug warmed her cold fingers as she sat across from him, the table a necessary barrier between them. "Why did you really come here?" she asked. "The truth this time." Cole wrapped his hands around his own mug, staring into the dark liquid as if it might hold answers. "I've been running for 6 months. Mexico, New Mexico, Indian Territory. But something kept pulling me back to Texas, to this part of it specifically. Didn't realize until I saw your light in the storm that I was looking for, hell, I don't know, absolution? A reminder of when things were simpler?" "Things were never simple," Ruth said quietly. "We just weren't old enough to see the complications." "Maybe." He lifted his gaze to hers. "Do you remember what I told you that night in your father's barn, when you brought me water?" Ruth's throat tightened. "You were feverish. People say all manner of things when they're not in their right mind. I was lucid enough. I said that one day, when the storms came, I'd return, that our paths would cross again when you needed it most." He leaned forward, the lamplight carving shadows beneath his cheekbones. Tell me you don't feel it too, this pull between us. Tell me it's just my imagination. Stop. The word came out harsher than she intended. Whatever you think you feel, whatever debt you imagine exists, it ends tonight. You'll leave at dawn and never return. I have a life, a husband, a future that doesn't include outlaws and their romantic notions. Cole studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Of course. You're right. He stood, moving to the window where rain still sheeted down the glass. Though I wonder if your husband knows how lucky he is, to have someone who'd patch up a wanted man in the dead of night, who'd risk everything for an old obligation. It's called honor, Ruth said stiffly. Samuel would understand. Would he? Cole turned back to her, his expression unreadable. Most men would shoot first and ask questions later, especially if they knew. Knew what? He shook his head. Nothing, just the ramblings of a tired outlaw. He returned to his makeshift bed by the stove, lowering himself carefully to protect his injured arm. You should get some rest. I'll be gone before you wake. Ruth retreated to her bedroom, locking the door with fingers that fumbled the key. She leaned against the solid wood, heart racing. What had he meant? What did he think Samuel should know? She moved to the small window, peering out at the storm-lashed night. The violence of the weather seemed to mirror her inner turmoil. Everything had been so clear just hours ago, her life mapped out in comfortable routines, her future secure in Samuel's steady hands. Now Cole's presence had stirred up sediment she'd thought long settled, clouding the waters of her certainty, changing into her nightgown. She caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman looking back seemed different somehow, wilder, more alive than the dutiful wife who'd started this day. She touched her cheek where a strand of wet hair had left its mark, remembering how Cole had looked at her, as if seeing past the facade she presented to the world. Stop it, she whispered fiercely to her reflection. You're not that girl anymore. But as she lay in bed, listening to the storm and the occasional creak of Cole moving in the other room, memories invaded despite her best efforts to keep them at bay. That long-ago night when she'd defied her father's orders and crept into the barn. Cole burning with fever, his hand catching hers with surprising strength. You have fire in you, little one, he'd murmured, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Hidden deep, but it's there. One day that fire's going to demand its due. She'd been 14, barely understanding what he meant. Now, 8 years later, lying in the bed she shared with her husband while another man sheltered in her home, she felt that fire flickering to life. It terrified her. Thunder crashed directly overhead, making her jump. In the brief silence that followed, she heard something else. Cole's voice, low and intense. Was he talking to himself? Praying? She strained to make out words, but couldn't. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time seemed fluid in the storm's embrace. Ruth dozed fitfully, dreams mixing with waking thoughts until she couldn't distinguish between them. In one, Samuel stood at the door, soaking wet, staring at her with betrayal in his eyes. In another, Cole touched her face with gentle fingers, whispering words in Spanish she didn't understand. She woke to a sound that wasn't the storm. Footsteps on the porch, deliberate and heavy. Her heart lurched. Samuel? But no, he wouldn't return in such weather. She reached for the rifle, then heard Cole moving in the other room. Quick and alert. A fist pounded on the door. Open up. We know he's in there. Ruth recognized the voice. Sheriff Watson from town. A man who'd always been coolly polite to her face while spreading gossip behind her back. Her mind raced. Someone must have seen Cole arrive, or perhaps tracked him here. She threw on a shawl and hurried to the main room. Cole stood ready, his gun belt buckled, his expression resigned. I'm sorry, he said simply. I've brought trouble to your door. Ruth Morrison, the sheriff's voice carried clearly through the door. We've got the place surrounded. Send him out, and there won't be any charges against you for harboring a fugitive. Charges? Ruth's voice rose with indignation. For giving shelter to someone in a storm? Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Watson called. We know Cole Hardin's in there. Tom Garrett saw him heading this way. Tom Garrett, the Bar J hand who'd brought Samuel's message. He must have doubled back, or perhaps had been watching the cabin all along. Ruth felt a surge of anger at the betrayal. Cole moved toward the door, but Ruth stepped in front of him. No, this is my home. They have no right. They have every right. Cole interrupted gently. I'm wanted in 3 states. Just being here puts a noose around your neck, too. He touched her shoulder briefly. The contact electric even through fabric. Let me go. It's better this way. Cole Hardin! Watson's patience was wearing thin. You've got 1 minute before we come in shooting. Ruth's mind worked furiously. The gold Cole had left, they'd find it. Assume she'd been paid off. Her reputation would be ruined. Samuel would return to find his wife branded as an outlaw's accomplice. There's another way, she said suddenly. The root cellar. It connects to an old mine shaft. Father showed me once. It comes out near Miller's Creek. Cole's eyes widened. Ruth, no. If they find out you helped me escape, they won't. She was already moving, pushing aside the rag rug to reveal the cellar door. I'll tell them you held me at gunpoint, that I had no choice. Go! For a moment, he hesitated, something raw and vulnerable crossing his features. Then he pulled her close, his lips brushing her forehead in a touch so light she might have imagined it. That fire I saw in you, don't let them extinguish it. Not the sheriff, not the town, not even your good husband. Promise me. Go, she hissed, shoving him toward the cellar. He disappeared into the darkness just as the door splintered inward. Sheriff Watson burst in, followed by 4 deputies, all with guns drawn. They found Ruth standing by the stove, disheveled and wide-eyed with what they took for fear. Where is he? Watson demanded, scanning the small cabin. He left, Ruth said, injecting a tremor into her voice. Right after the storm started to ease, said he couldn't stay, that someone might be tracking him. Watson's eyes narrowed. Don't lie to me, girl. We know he was here. Was, Ruth emphasized. He forced his way in, demanded food and medical supplies. I gave him what he wanted, and he left. Check the barn if you don't believe me. His horse is gone. One of the deputies ran to check, returning with confirmation. Watson surveyed the cabin suspiciously, his gaze lingering on the medical supplies still visible on the table. You doctored him? He was bleeding. I couldn't just let him. Even outlaws deserve basic Christian mercy. Sheriff, Watson snorted. Christian mercy's wasted on his kind. Which way did he ride? Ruth pointed east, the opposite direction from Miller's Creek. Toward the old Sullivan place. I think he mentioned something about friends waiting. The sheriff gathered his men. Bark orders about spreading out, cutting off escape routes. As they prepared to leave, Watson turned back to Ruth. You were lucky tonight, Mrs. Morrison. Next time a wanted man comes knocking, you'd best bar the door and send for help. Your husband wouldn't want you taking such risks. After they thundered off into the dying storm, Ruth sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. What had she done? She'd lied to the law, helped a fugitive escape, betrayed everything Samuel stood for. But deeper than guilt was another emotion, a fierce satisfaction that surprised her. She'd acted on instinct, followed her own moral compass rather than the rigid rules of propriety. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt truly alive. Outside, the storm was breaking apart, revealing stars between the racing clouds. Somewhere in the darkness, Cole Hardin was making his escape through passages carved by desperate men in an unforgiving land. And Ruth Morrison sat alone in her cabin, gold hidden beneath her floor and secrets branded on her heart, waiting for a husband who would return to find his wife forever changed by one stormy night when the outlaw had indeed claimed something precious. Not her sins, perhaps, but something far more dangerous, her certainty. Dawn broke gray and sullen over the Texas plains, the sky still bruised from the night's violence. Ruth stood in the doorway, surveying the damaged fence posts, snapped like matchsticks, the chicken coop listing badly to one side, debris scattered across the yard like bones after a feast. The storm had transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and hostile. She'd been working since first light, trying to restore some semblance of order before Samuel returned. Her dress was already soaked with sweat despite the morning coolness, her hands raw from hauling broken timber. Every muscle ached, but she welcomed the physical pain. It distracted from the turmoil in her mind. The sound of approaching horses made her heart skip. She shaded her eyes, recognizing Samuel's familiar silhouette against the brightening sky. He was riding hard, his mount lathered with sweat, and he wasn't alone. 2 other Bar J riders flanked him, their faces grim. Samuel swung down from his horse before it had fully stopped, crossing the yard in long strides. His face was haggard, his clothes dust-covered from hard riding, but it was the look in his eyes that made Ruth's stomach clench, a mixture of fear, anger, and something else she couldn't quite name. "Ruth!" He caught her shoulders, his grip almost painful. "Are you hurt? Did he—" He stopped, swallowing hard. Watson sent word, said Cole Hardin was here. "I'm fine," Ruth said, trying to keep her voice steady. "He's gone, left during the storm." Samuel's hands moved to cup her face, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones as if reassuring himself she was real and whole. "When I heard, God, Ruth, I thought—" He pulled her against him, crushing her to his chest. She could feel his heart racing through the worn fabric of his shirt. The other riders, Jim Paulson and Ed Carter, had dismounted and were examining the storm damage. Jim kicked at a piece of broken fence, whistling low. "Hell of a blow. You're lucky the whole place didn't come down around your ears, Mrs. Morrison." "We should check the perimeter," Ed suggested, his hand resting on his gun. "Make sure that outlaw's really gone." Samuel released Ruth reluctantly. "Do it. Check the barn, the sheds, anywhere a man might hide." He turned back to his wife, his blue eyes searching hers. "Tell me everything. From the beginning." Ruth had rehearsed this moment in the sleepless hours before dawn. But now, faced with Samuel's earnest concern, the lies felt like stones in her throat. "The storm was so fierce. I was trying to secure the barn when he appeared. He was hurt, bleeding. So you let him in." There was no accusation in Samuel's tone, just a flat statement of fact. "He had a gun," Ruth said, hating herself for the deception. "What choice did I have?" Samuel's jaw tightened. "None. You did right." He glanced around the disordered cabin, taking in the medical supplies still on the table, the blanket by the stove. "He stayed the night?" "Just until the storm eased. Then he left." "Sheriff Watson came not long after." "Which direction did he go?" Ruth pointed east, maintaining the lie she'd told Watson. "Toward the Sullivan place." Samuel nodded slowly, but something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Before he could question her further, Jim called from the barn. "Morrison, you need to see this." They found Jim in the empty stall where Cole's horse had been. He was kneeling beside a dark stain on the straw. "Blood, fair amount of it. That outlaw was hurt worse than he let on." Samuel studied the stain, then looked at Ruth. "You doctored him." It wasn't a question, but Ruth answered anyway. "I couldn't just let him bleed, even if he is. What he is. Christian mercy," Jim said with a snort that echoed Sheriff Watson's reaction. "That's what gets good people killed out here." "That's enough, Jim," Samuel said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "My wife did what she had to do to survive. I won't have anyone suggesting otherwise." The defense of her actions, even based on a false premise, made Ruth's guilt sharpen. She turned away, ostensibly to check the horses, but really to hide the emotion on her face. The men spent the next hour searching the property, but of course found nothing. Cole was long gone, following ancient passages through the earth toward whatever desperate freedom awaited him. Finally, Ed and Jim mounted up to continue the search with Watson's posse, leaving Samuel and Ruth alone. They worked side by side through the morning, clearing debris and making temporary repairs. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken questions. Ruth could feel Samuel watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, could sense the wheels turning in his mind. Finally, as they paused to share water from the well bucket, he spoke. "There's something you're not telling me." Ruth's hand stilled on the ladle. "I've told you everything." "Have you?" Samuel took the ladle from her, his fingers brushing hers. "Ruth, I know you. Know how you move, how you speak when you're easy in your mind versus when something's troubling you. Right now, you're wound tighter than a watch spring. A wanted killer spent the night in our home." Ruth said, trying for indignation. "Of course I'm troubled." Samuel set down the ladle and took her hands in his. His palms were rough from work, familiar and comforting. "I also know you're the bravest woman I've ever met. You wouldn't be this shaken just from facing down an outlaw? So what really happened?" Ruth looked into his honest blue eyes and felt her resolve crumbling. She wanted to tell him everything about her father's old debt, about recognizing Cole, about the root cellar and the lies she'd told Watson. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself saying, "He knew my father. Years ago, before we met. Father helped him when he was hurt. He remembered that kindness." Samuel's brow furrowed. "So he came here specifically? This wasn't random." "I don't know. Maybe. He said he was lost in the storm." "But he knew who you were, knew your maiden name." Ruth nodded miserably. Each truth she revealed seemed to demand 2 more lies to protect it. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Then he asked the question Ruth had been dreading. Was he respectful? Did he threaten you in any way? The concern in his voice nearly undid her. "No," she whispered. "He was respectful. If you didn't count the way he'd looked at her, the things he'd said about fire and passion. If you didn't count that feather-light kiss on her forehead that still burned like a brand." Samuel pulled her into his arms again, more gently this time. "I should have been here, should never have left you alone so long, if anything had happened to you. But nothing did," Ruth said against his chest. "I'm fine. We're fine." He held her for a long moment, and she felt the tension slowly leave his body. When he pulled back, some of the worry had eased from his features. "You're right. You're safe. That's what matters. But from now on, I'm not leaving you alone. Watson thinks Hardin's gang might be planning something in these parts, until they're caught or moved on. I'm staying close to home." Ruth nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The thought of Samuel's constant presence both comforted and troubled her. How could she sort through the chaos in her heart with him watching her every move? They returned to their work, but the dynamic had shifted. Samuel kept finding reasons to touch her, a hand on her back as he passed, fingers brushing hers as they lifted a broken board together. It was as if he was trying to reclaim her, to re-establish his place in her life. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, the heat growing oppressive, a rider appeared on the horizon. Samuel tensed, his hand moving to his gun, but Ruth recognized the horse. "It's Reverend Thomas," she said, surprised. The elderly minister rode up slowly, his black coat dusty and his face creased with concern. "Samuel, Ruth, I heard about your trouble last night. Came to see if there was anything you needed." "That's kind of you, Reverend," Samuel said, helping the older man dismount. "We're managing." Reverend Thomas looked around at the storm damage, then at Ruth. His knowing eyes seemed to see more than she wanted to reveal. These are trying times. The storm brings more than rain sometimes. It brings tests of faith, of character. Ruth showed plenty of both last night. Samuel said firmly, "Faced down a dangerous man and lived to tell of it." Indeed. The Reverend's gaze never left Ruth's face. Though sometimes the most dangerous tests come not from external threats, but from the tempests within our own hearts. The choices we make in the darkness, when no one is watching, those are what truly define us. Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks. Did he know? Had he always been able to see through her? This man who'd blessed her union with Samuel. "Would you pray with us?" "Reverend?" she asked, needing to deflect his penetrating gaze. They stood in a small circle in the yard, hands joined, as Reverend Thomas's voice rose and fell in familiar cadences. Lord, we thank you for your protection through the storm. We ask for your continued guidance as we navigate the trials ahead. Help us to choose righteousness over convenience, truth over deception, love over fear, and may we remember that your light shines brightest in our darkest moments. Amen. After the minister left, promising to check on them again soon, Samuel turned to Ruth with a wry smile. Old Thomas always did have a way of making you feel like he could see right into your soul. Yes, Ruth agreed faintly. He does. They worked until the heat became unbearable, then retreated to the relative coolness of the cabin. Samuel sat at the table, sketching plans for rebuilding the chicken coop, while Ruth prepared a simple meal. The domesticity of it should have been comforting, but she felt like she was playing a role, going through the motions of being the wife she'd been just yesterday. I've been thinking, Samuel said suddenly. Maybe this is a sign. What do you mean? He set down his pencil, looking at her earnestly. The storm, Hardin showing up, all this damage. Maybe it's God's way of telling us it's time to move on. I've saved enough for that down payment on the Henderson place. We could start fresh, build something better. Ruth's hand stilled on the bread she was slicing. Leave. Just when Cole had reappeared in her life. The thought filled her with an inexplicable panic. This is our home, she said carefully. We've worked so hard to establish ourselves here. And look what we have to show for it. Samuel gestured around the modest cabin. Ruth, I want more for us. For our children. When they come, a real house. Not a 2-room cabin. Land that's ours, not rented. A life where you don't have to face down outlaws in the middle of the night because I'm off working someone else's cattle. Our children. The words hit Ruth like a physical blow. She and Samuel had been married nearly a year with no sign of a child. It was a source of unspoken worry between them, made worse by the pitying looks of the town women. Maybe you're right, she said quietly, even as everything in her rebelled against the idea. Maybe a fresh start would be good. Samuel's face lit up. He rose and came to her, taking her hands. We could be happy there. Ruth, I know it. Away from all this, from the memories and the dangers, just you and me, building something together. She made herself smile, made herself nod. But as Samuel pulled her close, speaking excitedly of plans and possibilities, Ruth's mind was elsewhere. She thought of Cole somewhere out in the wild country, wounded and hunted. She thought of the gold hidden beneath her floorboards and the secrets hidden even deeper. The storm had passed, but its effects would linger long after the physical damage was repaired, in trying to protect her ordered life. Ruth had opened a door she wasn't sure she could close, and somewhere in the distance, carried on the hot wind, she could almost hear the echo of words spoken in darkness. One stormy night the outlaw claimed her sins. The question was, had he claimed them, or had he awakened them? The news reached town 3 days later like wildfire spreading through dry grass. Cole Hardin's gang had been spotted near Miller's Creek, and Sheriff Watson was forming a posse. Every able-bodied man was expected to join the hunt, and Samuel was among the first to volunteer. I have to go, he told Ruth as he cleaned his rifle in the pre-dawn darkness. After what happened here, I need to be part of ending this threat. Ruth watched him from the doorway, her wrapper pulled tight against the morning chill. Be careful. These men are desperate. Samuel looked up at her, something unreadable in his expression. I'll be careful. You just stay inside and keep the door barred. Jim Paulson's wife said she'd come by to check on you. After he left, Ruth paced the cabin like a caged animal. She knew Cole was too smart to be caught near Miller's Creek. He'd be miles away by now, following routes known only to outlaws and desert rats. But what if she was wrong? What if the posse got lucky? Near noon, she heard horses approaching fast. Her heart leaped to her throat as she grabbed the rifle. But it was only Ed Carter from the Bar J, his face grim with news. Mrs. Morrison, there's been trouble. You need to come quick. Samuel, the word came out as a whisper. He's alive, but hurt. They're bringing him to Doc Hartley's place. The gang ambushed the posse near Skeleton Ridge. Ruth didn't remember saddling her horse or the wild ride to town. All she knew was the terror clawing at her chest, the prayer repeating in her mind. Please let him be all right. Please. The doctor's office was crowded with wounded men and anxious families. Ruth pushed through until she found Samuel lying on a cot, his shoulder wrapped in bloody bandages. His face was pale, but his eyes were alert, tracking to her immediately. Ruth, he tried to sit up, wincing at the movement. Don't! She knelt beside the cot, taking his hand. What happened? They were waiting for us, Samuel said, his voice rough with pain. Like they knew we were coming. Opened fire from the rocks above. We never had a chance. Doc Hartley, a thin man with gentle hands, appeared at Ruth's shoulder. The bullet went clean through. He was lucky. Inch lower and it would have hit the lung. He'll recover, but he needs rest. Ruth stayed by Samuel's side as the doctor moved on to other patients. Around them, she heard fragments of conversation. 3 men dead, 5 wounded. The gang escaped without a single casualty. Morrison saw him. Someone was saying. Said Hardin himself was leading them, bold as brass. Samuel's hand tightened on hers. I did see him, he said quietly. For her ears alone. He could have killed me, Ruth, had me dead in his sights, but he shifted his aim at the last second, took my shoulder instead of my heart. Ruth's mouth went dry. Maybe he missed. Cole Hardin doesn't miss. Samuel's eyes searched hers. It's like he recognized me, knew who I was, but that doesn't make sense unless... The question hung between them, unspoken but deafening. Ruth forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. You're overthinking it. In the heat of battle, things happen. You're alive. That's what matters. But she could see the doubt settling into Samuel's features like dust into the cracks of old wood. They stayed in town that night, Ruth refusing to leave Samuel's side. As darkness fell, she heard a commotion outside, riders arriving, voices raised in anger and fear. Sheriff Watson burst through the door, his face flushed with rage and whiskey. They hit the Bennett Ranch while we were chasing shadows, he announced. Took everything, cattle, horses, even the money Bennett had hidden. Left this. He held up a piece of paper. Even from across the room, Ruth could see the bold handwriting. Watson read aloud. For the families of the men wounded today, let it not be said that Cole Hardin takes without giving back. C.O.H. A murmur ran through the room, anger from some, confusion from others. Ruth felt Samuel watching her and carefully kept her face neutral. Blood money, Watson spat. As if that makes up for the men we lost. At least their widows will eat this winter, someone countered. Earning a sharp look from the sheriff, the argument continued. But Ruth tuned it out. Cole was playing a dangerous game, robbing from the wealthy to aid the poor, maintaining his image as a folk hero among the desperate. It was clever, but it was also reckless. The more he tweaked the nose of authority, the more determined they'd become to see him hang. Late that night, as Samuel finally dozed under the influence of laudanum, Ruth stepped outside for air. The town was quiet, most windows dark. She walked to the edge of the boardwalk, looking out at the desert beyond the buildings. Somewhere out there, Cole and his men were bedded down under the stars, counting their stolen gains. Mrs. Morrison? She spun to find a Mexican boy, perhaps 12 years old, standing in the shadows. He held out a folded paper. For you, Senora. I was told to wait until you were alone. Ruth's hands trembled as she took the note. The boy melted back into the darkness before she could question him. By the light from the doctor's window, she read, He lives because of you. The debt grows ever larger. Destroy this. See. She crumpled the paper, her mind racing. Cole knew she'd warned him about the posse, but how? Unless he'd been watching, waiting near the cabin after his escape. The thought sent a shiver through her that wasn't entirely fear. Ruth? She turned to find Samuel standing in the doorway, favoring his wounded shoulder. You shouldn't be up. Neither should you be wandering alone at night. He came to stand beside her, his good arm sliding around her waist. "What's troubling you?" "Everything," she answered honestly. "You being hurt, the town in uproar, good men dead for no reason." "There's always a reason," Samuel said quietly. "Men like Hardin. They're angry at the world, at God, at anyone who has what they think they deserve. They dress it up in noble causes, but at the heart, it's just greed and violence." Ruth thought of the gold hidden beneath her floorboards, money she still hadn't touched, couldn't bring herself to either use or return. "Do you really believe that? That there's no principle behind their actions?" Samuel turned her to face him, his expression serious in the moonlight. "I believe that right and wrong aren't complicated. Ruth, you work for what you have. You protect what's yours. You help your neighbors when you can. You don't take what isn't freely given, and you don't justify sin by pointing at other sinners." His certainty should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like walls closing in. Ruth had always admired Samuel's moral clarity, but now she wondered if that clarity came from never having to make impossible choices. They returned inside, and Ruth helped Samuel back to his cot. As she adjusted his blanket, he caught her hand. "Ruth, I need to ask you something." Her heart stopped. "What?" "The night Hardin was at the cabin? Did he say anything? About his plans, about why he came to our place specifically?" The lie came easier now, worn smooth by repetition. "He was hurt and seeking shelter, that's all." Samuel studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, I just wondered. It seems like quite a coincidence, him showing up there right before all this happened." Ruth forced a laugh. "You're seeing patterns where there are none. Get some rest. You need to heal." But as she sat watching him sleep, she wondered how long she could maintain this deception. Every lie required two more to support it, and the weight of them was becoming unbearable. The next morning brought more bad news. 2 of the wounded men had died in the night, bringing the death toll to 5. The town seethed with rage and fear. Groups of armed men gathered on corners, talking of taking justice into their own hands. The Mexican families who lived on the poor side of town kept their children inside, sensing the ugly mood that might turn on anyone who looked like they might sympathize with Hardin's gang. Ruth was helping Doc Hartley change Samuel's bandage when they heard the thunder of hooves. Through the window, they watched a dozen hard-looking men ride in, led by a tall figure in a black coat, Marcus Thornton. Ruth recognized with a chill, a cattle baron from up north who was rumored to have his own private army. "Heard you boys were having trouble with rustlers," Thornton announced to the crowd that gathered. "Thought we'd lend a hand. My men are experienced in dealing with such problems." The implication in dealing with was clear. These weren't lawmen bound by legal niceties. They were hired killers who would shoot first and never bother with questions. Sheriff Watson emerged from his office, clearly torn between relief at the reinforcements and concern about losing control of the situation. "Mr. Thornton, we appreciate the offer, but no buts, Sheriff." Thornton's smile was cold. "Cole Hardin robbed me of near 1,000 head last spring. This is personal. We'll coordinate with your posse, of course, but make no mistake, we're here to see justice done." Ruth felt Samuel tense beneath her hands. "Thornton's men are little better than outlaws themselves," he murmured. "This is going to be a bloodbath." She finished wrapping his shoulder in silence, her thoughts churning. The stakes had just risen dramatically. It was no longer just local law enforcement hunting Cole. Now he had professional killers on his trail, and if they caught him, there would be no arrest, no trial, just a bullet or a rope, and probably both for good measure. As the day wore on, the town transformed into an armed camp. Thornton's men took over the saloon, their presence casting a pall over the streets. Ruth heard whispers that they'd already roughed up several Mexican farmers, demanding information about the gang's whereabouts. "We need to get home," Samuel said as evening approached. "I don't like the feel of things here." Ruth agreed, though for different reasons. She helped Samuel onto their wagon, taking the reins herself. As they rolled out of town, She caught a glimpse of Thornton standing on the saloon porch, watching them go. His gaze lingered on her in a way that made her skin crawl. The ride home was silent. Samuel dozed fitfully, occasionally jerking awake when the wagon hit a rough patch. Ruth's mind raced, trying to think of some way to warn Cole about Thornton's arrival, but how could she, without revealing everything? As they crested the last rise before home, Ruth pulled up short. Smoke was rising from the direction of their cabin, not the black smoke of destruction, but the gray curl of a cook fire. Someone was there. Samuel came fully awake, reaching for his gun despite his injured shoulder. "Stay behind me," he ordered, struggling down from the wagon. But as they approached cautiously, a familiar figure emerged from the cabin. Jim Paulson's wife, Mary, waved cheerfully. "There you are. I came by to tidy up and get supper started. Figured you'd be hungry after all that trouble in town." The relief was so intense, Ruth nearly laughed. They found not only Mary, but 2 other neighbor women inside. The cabin spotless and a pot of stew bubbling on the stove. It was kindness of the sort that made frontier life bearable. But Ruth couldn't fully appreciate it. Her nerves were strung too tight, her secrets too heavy. After the women left with promises to check in again tomorrow, Ruth helped Samuel to bed. He was asleep within minutes, exhausted by pain and medicine. She sat beside him in the gathering darkness, watching his chest rise and fall, loving him and hating herself in equal measure. A sound outside made her stiffen, not quite footsteps, more like the whisper of wind through grass. But the air was still. She rose quietly, took the rifle, and stepped onto the porch. The figure materialized from the shadows so smoothly she barely had time to raise the weapon. Cole stood at the edge of the porch light, hands visible and empty. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered fiercely. "There are killers looking for you. I know. Thornton's men." His voice was calm, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "I came to thank you, and to say goodbye." "Goodbye? We're leaving the territory. It's getting too hot, and I won't have my men slaughtered for my pride." He stepped closer, and she could see his face clearly. The wound she'd stitched was healing, but there were new lines around his eyes. "I wanted you to know. What happened today wasn't random. We knew the posse was coming because you sent them east while I went west. You saved my life twice over." "I saved Samuel's life," Ruth corrected. "If you'd been caught that night, he would have ridden with the posse anyway. This way, at least he's alive." Cole smiled, sad and knowing. "You can tell yourself that if it helps, but we both know there's more to it." He reached into his coat, and Ruth tensed, but he only withdrew an envelope. "This is for you. Don't open it until I'm long gone." She took it with numb fingers. "Cole, take care of yourself, Ruth Morrison, and take care of that good man in there. He's luckier than he knows." He touched his hat brim in farewell. Maybe in another life, things could have been different. But in this one, we are what we are. He melted back into the darkness as smoothly as he'd appeared. Ruth stood frozen, the envelope burning in her hand, until she heard the distant sound of horses moving away. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. Inside. Samuel stirred but didn't wake. Ruth tucked the envelope beneath her mother's Bible, another secret added to her growing collection. Tomorrow, Thornton's men would spread out across the territory, hunting for a gang already gone. The town would slowly return to normal. Samuel would heal. Life would go on. But Ruth knew that nothing would ever be quite the same. The storm had passed, but it had left its mark on more than just the landscape. And somewhere in the vast Texas night, an outlaw rode toward the horizon, carrying with him a piece of her heart she hadn't known she'd given. Dawn came slowly to the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of ash and pearl. Ruth stood among the wreckage of what had been their home, her bare feet sinking into soil still damp with blood. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the air like a shroud, mixing with the smoke that rose from the smoldering remains of the barn. Samuel lay propped against the overturned water trough, Mary Paulson pressing cloth to the wound in his side while her husband Jim kept watch with his rifle. The bodies of the outlaws were scattered across the yard. 3 of them, maybe 4. It was hard to tell in the devastation, but they had taken their toll. Ed Carter was dead, shot through the heart in the first volley. Young Tom Garrett wouldn't last the hour, not with those wounds. "Ruth." Samuel's voice was weak but urgent. She knelt beside him, taking his hand. His fingers were cold despite the warming air. "Are you hurt?" "No." She brushed matted hair from his forehead, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Save your strength. Listen to me." His grip tightened with desperate strength. "Whatever happens, I'm proud of you, the way you fought. You were magnificent." She wanted to weep at the irony. Magnificent. If only he knew that she'd recognized one of the attackers in the chaos, Miguel Santos, who rode with Cole's gang. That, in the split second when Miguel had her in his sights, she'd seen recognition dawn in his eyes too. Seen him deliberately aim wide, that the only reason she was alive was because word had somehow spread that she was under Cole's protection. "Doc Hartley's coming," Jim called from his position by the gate. "I can see his wagon." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. The doctor worked with grim efficiency, extracting bullets and stitching wounds while trying to save those who could be saved. Tom Garrett died as the sun cleared the horizon, his mother's name on his lips. They laid him out beside Ed Carter, covered them both with quilts that would have to serve as shrouds. Sheriff Watson arrived with more men as the doctor was finishing with Samuel. The lawman surveyed the carnage with satisfaction mixed with frustration. "Damn shame about Carter and the boy, but at least we bloodied them good. Any of you get a clear look at the leaders?" "It was dark," Jim said. "They hit us fast and hard." Ruth remained silent, remembering the moment when the riders had burst from the pre-dawn darkness. She'd grabbed Samuel's rifle and fired without thinking. Her father's training taking over. She'd fought for her life, for Samuel's life, but all the while a part of her had been screaming that this was wrong. All wrong. These weren't supposed to be Cole's men. He'd promised they were leaving the territory. Watson kicked at one of the bodies. Mexican, like most of Hardin's gang, though this one... He rolled another corpse over with his boot. "This one's new. Don't recognize him." Ruth did. Jake Summers, one of Thornton's hired guns. Her blood ran cold as the implications hit her. This hadn't been Cole's gang at all, or at least, not just his gang. "Sheriff," she said carefully, "that man was in town yesterday. I saw him drinking with Thornton's crew." Watson frowned, kneeling to examine the body more closely. "You're right. What the hell was one of Thornton's men doing riding with outlaws?" Before anyone could speculate, the thunder of hooves announced new arrivals. Thornton himself rode in with a dozen men, their face hard and watchful. The cattle baron dismounted slowly, his eyes taking in the scene with an expression Ruth couldn't read. "Heard you had some trouble," he said to Watson. "My men and I were tracking the gang north of here. Seems they doubled back." "Seems so," Watson agreed, but there was new suspicion in his voice. "Also seems one of your men got himself mixed up with them." Thornton's gaze flicked to the body of Jake Summers, but his expression didn't change. "Summers? He went missing 2 days ago. Probably captured and forced to ride with them. These outlaws have no honor." It was a smooth lie, delivered with practiced ease. Ruth saw Watson accept it, saw the doubt fade from the sheriff's face, but she knew better. This attack hadn't been random. Someone had orchestrated it, and she had a sick feeling she knew why, as if reading her thoughts. Thornton turned to her. "Mrs. Morrison, I heard you acquitted yourself well in the fight. Your husband's a lucky man." "Lucky?" Ruth's voice came out sharper than intended. "2 good men are dead. My husband's gravely wounded, and our home is destroyed. Where's the luck in that?" Thornton's smile was thin. "You're alive. In my experience, that's always lucky." Doc Hartley intervened before she could respond. "Samuel needs rest and care. We should get him to town." They loaded Samuel onto the doctor's wagon, Ruth climbing up beside him. As they prepared to leave, she looked back at their cabin one last time. The walls still stood, but the windows were shattered, the door hanging off its hinges. Everything they'd built everything they'd worked for, violated and broken. "We'll post guards," Watson assured her. "Make sure no one disturbs anything until you can come back and salvage what you can." But Ruth knew she would never come back. Not to live. This place was poisoned now, tainted with violence and secrets. The ride to town was agony, every bump and rut sending fresh waves of pain through Samuel. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering things that made Ruth's heart clench. "Should have been there sooner," he said at one point. "Should have protected you." "You did protect me," she whispered, holding his hand. "You taught me to shoot, remember? That's what saved us." Doc Hartley had cleared out a room in his house for them, his wife fussing over Ruth like a mother hen. But Ruth couldn't rest. She paced the small room, her mind churning. The attack made no sense unless... The envelope. Cole's farewell gift that she'd hidden but never opened. Heart pounding. She slipped out and made her way to the church. Reverend Thomas was preparing for the funeral service, his weathered face sorrowful. "Ruth, how is Samuel?" "Resting, Reverend. I need to ask a favor. I hid something in our cabin for safekeeping. My mother's jewelry. Could you send someone you trust to retrieve it? I know it seems frivolous, but say no more." He patted her shoulder gently. "I'll go myself." "Where should I look?" She told him about the loose floorboard, praying the envelope had survived the attack. An hour later, he returned with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "This was all I found. I'm afraid the jewelry box was empty, likely stolen in the raid." Ruth clutched the bundle, feeling the envelope inside. "Thank you. At least I have this." She waited until she was alone to open Cole's letter. His handwriting was bold but careful, as if he'd taken pains to make it legible. "Ruth, by the time you read this, I'll be long gone, but I couldn't leave without warning you. Thornton's playing a deeper game than anyone realizes. He's been using the raids as cover for his own land grabs, hiring men to pose as my gang while he forces out the small ranchers. Your place sits on water rights he wants. Watch yourself. He's already decided you know too much. Saw it in his eyes when he looked at you in town. If something happens, if trouble comes, get word to Father Miguel at the San Antonio mission. Tell him I sent you. He'll help. I'm sorry for the pain I've brought to your door. You deserve better than to be caught between my world and yours. But know this, you have more strength than you realize. Use it. Destroy this letter. Trust no one except your husband. Even the law might be in Thornton's pocket. May you find the peace I never could." Ruth read it twice more, then held it to the lamp flame until it was ash. Everything made terrible sense now. The attack hadn't been revenge for the failed ambush. It had been Thornton cleaning house, eliminating witnesses who might connect his men to the raids. The fact that Cole's gang was being blamed was just convenient cover. She returned to Samuel's bedside to find him awake and lucid, though still weak. His eyes tracked to her immediately, reading the distress on her face. "What is it?" Ruth sat beside him, choosing her words carefully. "I think the attack wasn't what it seemed. That dead gunman, the one who rode for Thornton. I don't think he was a captive. I think Thornton's been using the outlaw scare to drive out smaller ranchers." Samuel frowned, processing this. "That's a serious accusation." "I know, but think about it. Who benefits if we abandon our land? Who's been buying up failed homesteads all along the water routes? Thornton." Samuel's voice was grim. "But we can't prove anything. And if you're right, if he's that ruthless..." He gripped her hand. "We're leaving. As soon as I can travel. We're going to California. My cousin has a store in Sacramento. We can start over." Ruth felt relief wash through her. "Yes, we'll go west. Leave all this behind?" But even as she agreed, she wondered if you could ever truly leave the past behind. The memory of violence, the weight of secrets, the ghost of what might have been. These things traveled with you no matter how far you ran. Over the next days, the town tried to return to normal. They buried Ed Carter and Tom Garrett in the small cemetery, Reverend Thomas speaking words of comfort over the raw earth. The posse continued to search for Cole's gang, though the trail had gone cold. Thornton's men were everywhere, questioning anyone who might have information, their methods growing increasingly harsh. Ruth spent her days nursing Samuel and her nights planning their escape. She sold what she could salvage from the cabin, putting together traveling money. The gold Cole had left remained hidden. She couldn't use it without raising questions. It would stay buried, another secret the Texas earth would keep. Samuel grew stronger slowly. The wound had been deep but clean, missing vital organs by inches. He was quiet during his recovery, watching Ruth with eyes that seemed to see too much. One evening, as she changed his bandages, he finally spoke what had been weighing on him. "That night, when Hardin came to the cabin, you knew him from before, didn't you?" Ruth's hand stilled. She could lie, had become accomplished at it, but looking into Samuel's honest eyes, she found she couldn't. Not anymore. "Yes, my father helped him once. Years ago. He remembered." Samuel absorbed this, then asked the harder question. "Is that all it was? An old debt repaid?" "What are you asking me, Samuel?" "I'm asking if I need to worry, if there's something between you and him that I should know about." Ruth finished with the bandage and sat back, meeting his gaze directly. "Cole Hardin is gone. Whatever he was to my father, whatever debt existed, it's finished. You're my husband. You're my choice. That's all that matters." It wasn't quite the whole truth, but it was all the truth she could offer. Samuel studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, I believe you." 3 weeks after the attack, they were ready to leave. Samuel could ride, though carefully. They had a wagon loaded with their few remaining possessions, supplies for the journey, and hope for a new beginning. Half the town turned out to see them off, including Sheriff Watson. "Shame to lose good folks like you," he said, shaking Samuel's hand. "But I understand. This territory's getting too wild for decent people." Thornton was notably absent, though Ruth saw several of his men watching from the saloon. Let them watch. By the time Thornton realized his scheme had driven them off their land without him gaining the water rights, they'd be long gone. Reverend Thomas blessed their journey, his knowing eyes holding Ruth's for an extra moment. "May you find peace in your new home," he said, "and may the past rest easy behind you." As they rode out of Cedar Ridge, Ruth turned for one last look. The town sat baking in the morning sun, already seeming smaller, less significant, somewhere beyond the horizon. Cole and his gang were carving out their own version of justice. Behind them, Thornton would continue his schemes, though perhaps more carefully now that one had gone awry. But that was no longer her concern. She had Samuel. She had their future. She had a chance to build something new without the weight of secrets and old debts. It would have to be enough. The wagon rolled west, wheels creaking a rhythm that sounded almost like absolution. And if Ruth sometimes dreamed of storm clouds and dark eyes, of choices made and unmade, of fires that demanded their due, well, that was between her and the vast, uncaring sky that stretched endlessly ahead. 6 months had passed since they'd left Cedar Ridge, and the California sun painted their small farmstead in shades of gold and green that Ruth had never imagined possible in Texas. The orange trees Samuel had planted were beginning to take root, their glossy leaves catching the afternoon light. She stood on the porch of their new home, modest but solid, with real glass windows and a floor that didn't creak with every step. Samuel emerged from the barn, moving with only the slightest stiffness from his old wound. The California climate had been good for his recovery, and his face had lost the drawn, worried look it had carried those last weeks in Texas. He smiled at her, the expression reaching his eyes in a way it hadn't for months. "Letter came," he said, holding up an envelope. "From Jim Paulson." They sat together on the porch steps as Samuel read aloud. The news from Texas was mixed. Sheriff Watson had been voted out of office, replaced by a younger man who seemed less inclined to look the other way regarding Thornton's activities. There had been 3 more raids attributed to Cole's gang, though Jim noted that folks were beginning to question whether all the violence could be laid at one man's feet. "And here's something interesting," Samuel continued. "Jim says Thornton's empire is starting to crack. lost a big government contract for cattle, and 2 of his hired guns were found dead on the road to San Antonio. No one knows who did it, but Jim thinks it might be vigilante justice. Ruth kept her expression neutral, though her heart raced. She thought of Cole's letter, of his warning about Thornton. Had he decided to take action from whatever hideout he'd found? Or were there others willing to stand against the cattle baron's tyranny? "Does he mention the Hendersons' place?" she asked, remembering their old neighbors. "Abandoned, like half the other small ranches in the county. Thornton's buying them up for pennies on the dollar." Samuel folded the letter, his jaw tight. "We got out just in time." That evening, as they worked side by side in the garden, Ruth found herself thinking about transformation. The woman who knelt in the California soil, coaxing life from seeds, seemed a stranger to the one who'd fought for her life in a Texas dawn. Yet both were her. Just as the man beside her was both the idealistic cowboy she'd married and the harder, wiser person shaped by violence and betrayal. "Ruth?" Samuel's voice drew her from her thoughts. "Where do you go when you get that look?" She smiled, wiping dirt from her hands. "Just thinking about how different things are now. How different we are." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "The other day, Reverend Mills asked if I ever regretted coming west, leaving everything behind." "What did you tell him?" "That I'd do it again in a heartbeat. That what we have now, this peace, this life we're building, it's worth any price." He paused. "But I wonder sometimes if you feel the same, if you miss anything from before." Ruth heard the unspoken question beneath his words. Did she miss the excitement, the danger, the dark-eyed outlaw who'd stirred something wild in her heart? "I miss my father," she said honestly. "I miss the friends we left behind, but regret leaving?" She shook her head. "Never. This is where we belong. Samuel, where our children will grow up free from the shadows of that place." The mention of children made them both quiet. It was another unspoken worry between them. Over a year married and still no sign of a baby. But California had brought hope in this too. Ruth had found a midwife who specialized in helping women conceive, who'd given her herbs and advice that seemed to be working. She hadn't told Samuel yet, wanting to be sure, but she'd missed her monthly time twice now. 2 weeks later, their peaceful routine was shattered by unexpected visitors. Ruth was hanging laundry when she saw the riders approaching. 2 men, moving with the easy grace of those accustomed to long days in the saddle. Her hand went instinctively to where a gun would have been in Texas, finding only empty air. But as they drew closer, she recognized the lead rider and her heart nearly stopped. Not Cole, the build was wrong, but Miguel Santos, the man who deliberately missed his shot during the raid. Beside him rode a younger man she didn't know. "Mrs. Morrison." Miguel touched his hat brim respectfully. "Sorry to trouble you. Is your husband about?" "He's in the lower field," Ruth managed, her mouth dry. "What do you want?" "Just to talk, Senora. To bring news that might interest you both." Samuel must have seen the riders too, for he was already walking up from the fields, his own hand hovering near the pistol he still carried. His face went hard when he recognized Miguel. "You've got some nerve showing up here," Samuel said coldly. Miguel raised his hands peacefully. "I come with no bad intentions, Senor Morrison, only to repay a debt and deliver a message." "What debt?" Samuel demanded, though Ruth knew. The deliberately missed shot that had saved her life. "Perhaps we could speak inside," Miguel suggested. "The walls have ears, even in California." After a tense moment, Samuel nodded. They gathered around the kitchen table, the atmosphere thick with suspicion and unspoken history. Miguel accepted coffee gratefully, then began his tale. "Cole is dead," he said simply, and Ruth felt the world tilt. "Killed 3 months ago in Mexico, but before he died, he gave me instructions, things to make right." From his saddlebag, Miguel produced a leather portfolio. "Papers," he explained, "proof of Thornton's schemes, records of bribes, hired killings, land fraud, Cole spent months gathering evidence, trading gold for documents, tracking down witnesses. He said if anything happened to him, I was to bring these to you. Why us? Samuel asked, even as Ruth knew the answer. Because you were victims who survived. Because you have no ties to Texas law that might be corrupt. Because... Miguel glanced at Ruth. Cole trusted you to see justice done. Ruth's hands trembled as she opened the portfolio. Page after page of damning evidence, signed confessions, financial records, even a letter in Thornton's own hand ordering the murder of a rival rancher. It was enough to hang him twice over. There's more, Miguel said quietly. Cole left instructions for the gold from our raids to be distributed to the families Thornton destroyed. It's already been done. And Senora. He pulled out a smaller envelope, sealed with wax. This is for you alone. Samuel stiffened, but Ruth took the letter without hesitation. Whatever last words Cole had for her, she would not dishonor his memory by refusing them. What do you expect us to do with this evidence? Samuel asked Miguel. There's a federal marshal in San Francisco, James Harper. He's honest. Cole made sure of that. Give him the papers. Let the law finish what Cole started. After the men left, Samuel and Ruth sat in silence, the portfolio between them like an unexploded shell. Finally, Samuel spoke. You should read his letter. Ruth broke the seal with unsteady fingers. Cole's handwriting was shakier than before, as if written in haste or pain. Ruth, if you're reading this, then Miguel kept his promise and I kept mine. The evidence will bring Thornton down. Your safety is assured. I want you to know that meeting you again, that storm night changed my path. You showed me that some things are worth protecting, not just avenging. I spent my last months trying to be the man that young girl in the barn might have believed I could become. Be happy with your Samuel. He's a better man than I ever was. But know that in another life, another world, I would have tried to deserve you. No more debts between us now. Live free. Cole. Ruth read it twice, then handed it to Samuel. He read in silence, his expression cycling through emotions she couldn't quite track. When he finished, he set the letter aside and took her hands. He loved you, Samuel said simply. I think I always knew that. Samuel, no, let me finish. He loved you, but you chose me, and you've chosen me every day since, even when it was hard, even when there were secrets between us. That matters more than anything else. Ruth felt tears spill down her cheeks. I do choose you. Always. They held each other as the afternoon shadows lengthened. Two people who had walked through fire and emerged scarred but whole. Later, they would take the evidence to Marshal Harper. They would see justice done for the families destroyed by greed. They would build their life here in California, have the children they dreamed of, grow old in peace. But first, Ruth took Cole's letter to the stove and watched it burn, saying a quiet prayer for the soul of a man who'd found redemption too late for himself, but perhaps just in time for others. The smoke curled up and disappeared, carrying with it the last of the secrets, the might-have-beens, the roads not taken. Outside, a mockingbird began its evening song, the notes carrying on the clean California air. Samuel's arms tightened around her, and Ruth leaned into his warmth, feeling the tiny flutter in her belly that she would soon tell him about, new life quickening where there had been so much death. The past was done with them at last. Cole had been right about one thing. She was free now, free to love without reservation, to build without fear, to face the future with nothing hidden in her heart. 3 weeks later, the newspapers carried the story of Marcus Thornton's arrest on federal charges. Within 6 months, his empire had crumbled, his lands redistributed to the families he'd cheated. Some said it was justice. Others called it the final revenge of a dead outlaw. Ruth, reading the news while her husband worked the orange groves and new life grew beneath her heart, knew it was both. And perhaps that was as it should be. Justice and revenge intertwined like lovers, like enemies, like the complex threads of a life lived in the borderlands between right and wrong. She folded the newspaper and went to join Samuel in the grove, leaving the past in newsprint and shadow where it belonged. Ahead lay only sunlight and possibility. and the promise of storms that would water the earth instead of washing it in blood. The preacher had blessed their union, and one stormy night the outlaw had claimed something indefinable. But in the end, it was Ruth who had claimed her own life, her own choices, her own sins and redemptions, and that, perhaps, was the greatest freedom of all. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West tale of love, betrayal, and redemption. I'd love to hear where you're enjoying this story from, whether you're driving through the desert, relaxing at home, or perhaps even somewhere in the Old West itself. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Ruth and Samuel's journey in the comments below. Did Cole find redemption? Did Ruth make the right choices? Let's discuss this complex story together.